Hi, welcome to Beyond Politics. I'm Catherine Clark. Nazanin Afshin-Jam MacKay is a well-known activist, author, and humanitarian, and her life has been cast into a whole new spotlight recently with her marriage to Canada's Minister of Defence, Peter MacKay. Nazanin came to Canada at a young age with her parents, who are fleeing the revolution in Iran, and she joins me now to talk about life beyond politics. Nazanin Afshin-Jam MacKay, welcome to Beyond Politics. It's a great pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Catherine. It's a pleasure being with you.
It's nice to meet you, too.
Yes,
because
finally.
I've heard a lot about you, and I'm glad to finally have the opportunity.
Likewise. Peter speaks highly of your father and yourself, and so it's nice to be here.
Well, that's very kind. We had your husband on the show, I guess a couple weeks ago now, and it was great to see him, too, because, of course, I first met him when he had just become a member of Parliament, and this was way back when. And originally, he knew my husband before he knew any of us, because my husband worked on the Hill. So this world of politics, as I'm sure you have discovered, is all very closely intertwined.
It is closely, and it's like a family. That's what I've been hearing.
Yes, and probably experiencing in a way too. The idea that it is. Well, it's often a closer family if you sit on the same side of the political spectrum.
Right.
Yeah, more like a family squabble if you don't.
Yes,
So,
I mean, I've worked with people from all sides, so I see it as a greater family, a nonpartisan family, but definitely when you're wrapped in partisan politics, it feels very close-knit.
You know, you raised such an interesting point because you have been nonpartisan up until this point, and you've had to be, and because of the activist work that you've done. And yet now you are identified as being married to someone who is from a particular political party. Has that affected how you can approach the activist work that you do?
Thankfully, it hasn't. Peter knew when we first started to date and then we got married that this was something that was very key to my life, is to remain nonpartisan. The type of activist work I do, I want to include all people because it's really for the betterment of humanity, and you can't put borders or definitions on that. And so he's never told me that I can't say something or restricted me from sharing my views. And so it hasn't restricted me in that way. Of course, I'm more mindful.
Sure.
But up until now, if I have an opinion, I will share it, and even if it goes against the political leanings of the current government.
You are expecting your first child. It's an exciting time. Do you worry, as a woman, as a professional, who dedicates so much of her time to being an activist and being involved, and also being married to someone who has a demanding schedule that often requires you to take part in events? Do you worry that that having a child is going to impact your ability to be as vocal as you have been?
I definitely know it's going to be a challenge. I mean, just as of now, balancing my work life with Peter's work life and finding a time when we can actually see one another, that in itself is already a challenge. And I can just imagine with a new child on the way, it's going to further complicate things. But naturally, when the child comes, I'll want to slow down my activities. I mean, there's no way I can be a full-time mother at the same time working on my activities to the same extent. I mean, I will still try to continue where I can in helping human rights and democracy activism related to my home country of Iran. But I also want to be a very hands-on mother. I want to raise my baby, and so Peter and I will have to discuss further as the time goes on. I mean, I think it's just going to have to be an evolutionary prospect to find out how do we manage that time? And I see Peter, who gets up super early in the morning and most often comes very late home at night, and then of course on weekends goes back to his constituency, and then of course goes on international trips to different conferences. So with a baby on board, it's going to be different. And
I don't know how you guys manage it, honestly, because it is a lot. And I mean, I suppose the great thing is that there's television and internet, so you can actually see your husband every day somewhere, wherever he may be in the world, even if it's not with you. But it is a lot to try to balance such busy schedules.
Yeah, I mean, with my own work, I have to travel quite a bit for speaking engagements, and of course Peter is away too. So physically, we might not be next to one another, but we maintain regular contact. We're always, communicating through internet, and we make a point to not lose too much time between. Yeah.
I was interested about how you became an activist. I understand that your father, you were born in Iran, although you only lived there a short period of time, that your father was tortured there, and that you discovered that as a child. It wasn't something you necessarily talked about, but you discovered it as a child. Is that what compelled you to become an activist?
Actually, my humanitarian side started before I even discovered what happened to my father. I was just a very sensitive child, and I always wanted to help other people out. I could feel other people's misery or pain, and I always wanted to somehow take that away. So I started working at soup kitchens from an early age, and started to volunteer my time. But I think definitely learning about my father's personal story, about having had to, leave Iran because of political reasons, it subconsciously affected me later as a teen and then as an adult. And I guess maybe in part it compels me to continue the activities that I do in terms of trying to promote freedom and democracy in Iran. But it's not the key point.
Right.
It's more after I found out what happened to him. I asked a lot of questions from my mother and father, asking, why do we have to be separated from my grandmother and cousins, and learning more about the history of Iran and the struggles that people have faced under this current regime, and just learning more and more about how people are suffering. I turned internally and said, well, how can I actually do something to help this situation?
Right.
So in that capacity, yes, but it was also learning about all the other stories of women who are being legally discriminated against, or people that are being persecuted for their religion or their ethnic backgrounds in Iran. So when I gained a bit of notoriety as Miss Canada many years ago, a lot of Iranians turned to me as a kind of a vehicle to try to bounce off ideas on how I could help them in a certain regard. And then I learned about their personal stories and got quite involved.
Did you mind that pressure, that sense that there was an entire community that wanted and needed your help?
Well, I was flattered that they would turn to me as a source. I had been working as a Red Cross Global Youth Educator, so they knew my background as a humanitarian and as a leader sort of in the Iranian Canadian community. But it was a lot of pressure, and it still is a lot of pressure. There's a lot of weight on my shoulders to try to deliver, for them, whether it be refugees who are seeking asylum in a host country, or, as I said, women who are trying to leave abusive relationships and wanting custody of their children. I mean, the range is very vast, and unfortunately I can't help every single one of them, and so that affects me. But I've gotten a lot better at delegating and coming into contact with a lot of different organizations now, that I can use my networks and pass on some of these cases to people who can really help them more specifically.
Do you ever think about the fact that you're able to do this because your family had to flee? If what had happened to your parents, and I'd like to talk a little bit about what happened and the revolution and their experience of it, but that if you hadn't, in fact, had to flee Iran, you would not have been able to be an advocate. You would have needed someone else.
There's no way I could do the work that I do now if I was still living in Iran. I mean, just we see today human rights defenders that are defending political prisoners or children on death row. They're now the ones that are being imprisoned. There's this one lawyer of a Christian pastor who was on death row, and he was simply representing him as his lawyer, and now he's faced, a prison sentence. And then there's one of my idols, Nazanin Afshin-Jam, who's a lawyer, and she was defending children on death row and women who are being discriminated against and political prisoners, and she's been in prison for a couple of years now. She just finished a hunger strike because the authorities weren't allowing her to see her children even in prison. And so they're now the ones that are being held behind bars. If I was in Iran speaking the way I do out against this regime, then I would either be imprisoned, tortured, or even executed for what I have to say. So as a result of the situation, living in Canada, where I have freedom of expression, I have the right to speak out, then I'm using that to be able to be a voice for the voiceless on the inside of Iran.
The imprisonment, torture, things you've just said, those happened to your dad. What happened?
My father wasn't even a political man, and normally those that were being imprisoned or executed were very much those on the front line advocating against what was happening, or were very pro-Shah at the time, and they were trying to exterminate them, or the leftists that were trying to gain leadership. My father was the general manager of the Sheraton Hotel, and he was conducting business as usual, allowing music and mingling between men and women, dancing, and alcohol was now forbidden under these new Islamic rules, but nobody was telling these new rules to the community. So one day the Revolutionary Guards burst in and arrested my father and beat him up and threw him in jail and tortured him further with lashes to his back. And they wanted to give him the execution decree, but the man that was going to give him the death sentence got into a car accident.
Yeah, what a twist of fate, eh?
Yes, it bought my mother time to make some phone calls, and through that experience she was able to get him temporarily released until he'd have a trial. But he wasn't going to wait around for a trial, as he saw his peers and colleagues being executed left, right, and center. So he went into hiding, and as soon as his wounds healed enough that he could actually sit down on a chair, he was then on the first plane ride to Spain, where we followed, and then a year later we immigrated to Canada.
Why Canada?
They heard that Canada was a good place to raise children. They were contemplating between Canada, Australia, the United States, or different parts of Europe, and they just kept hearing what a wonderful country Canada was, and it's a good place to good place to have opportunities for your children. So,
but they landed in Montreal and they almost had second thoughts.
Yes, they landed in Montreal. It was the middle of winter. There was probably snow up to here.
Yeah.
And their eyes bugged out, and they said, "What are we doing?" No, but some of their friends and colleagues were saying, "Oh, you're in Montreal and you're in Canada. It's so cold there. Your ears and nose will fall off." And they believed it. And they said, "Well, where's the warmest place in Canada?" And then they heard Vancouver was mild.
Right.
So then the next day we're on the plane to Vancouver, and that's where I was raised.
That's so funny. I think it's probably a quintessential story of immigration to Canada. People land and they just think, what have I done? You still remain, as a family, it seems, very proud of your Iranian heritage. Mm-hmm. Is it difficult for you to reconcile the two sides of the country that you know? The one side that represents your family and the way of life that your parents knew and enjoyed before the revolution, and the other one that that sees violence and aggression that you work very hard to eradicate?
Well, it's not hard in the sense that, you know, the culture that we were brought up in Iran very much resembles the culture that I experience here in Canada.
Right.
You know, they're very open-minded people, very, you know, educated, and so there wasn't a cultural clash in that regards. It's more now reconciling how our country has basically spiraled back into the Middle Ages, whereas once it was a prospering nation, now under this regime, there's so many human rights abuses on a daily basis. The economy, as you know, has also spiraled downhill as a result of the corruption and just the awful rhetoric that the leaders spew on a daily basis and alienate themselves from the international community. So it's hard for us to see that a country with so much potential could be so backwards now, and that's what pains us. And what pains me personally is getting these personal stories from people who really want an escape. Either they want to leave Iran or they want drastic changes for this regime to fall and for there to be a new democratic country so that they can have their voices heard and that the laws reflect their thoughts. Because as you know, the current regime in power, it's a small group of hardliners that are in power that impose their will on the entire nation and doesn't reflect the intellect and the thoughts of the people who really want the same things that we enjoy here in Canada.
Tell me what you were like as a little girl. Were you this intense as a little girl? You said that you were very sensitive as a child.
I was very sensitive. I was very serious.
Yeah, I can see that.
I took my school very seriously and, you know, very studious, and it didn't make me very popular with my other friends though, and in school though, because, you know, I wanted
because
to be
you had straight A's, and
I had straight A's. I was very involved in all the clubs and sports and theaters and like anything you could sign up to. It was like teacher, and so anyways, I got made fun of and bullied for
Did you really?
For some of those things. Yeah, particularly in high school. In elementary, everything goes, but as soon as you're in high school and cliques form and you're not quote unquote cool, then you're shunned. I had a good group of friends, so I wasn't.
And luckily, you've had the last laugh. Ha.
Well, I mean, you know, I've just worked very hard to this point in my life, and I feel very blessed for the blessings that God gave me, and I wanted to use the blessings that He'd given me. So, in that capacity, I have no regrets. But you know, high school was hard enough. Just being a teenager and going through all those emotions, but it's all right. Now, actually, a lot of those same students have apologized since then.
Oh, that's nice to hear. That's nice to hear. Did you know what you wanted to be when you grew up? I mean, did you have an idea of a particular profession that you wanted to follow, or did your parents want you to be something in particular?
I didn't know specifically what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to go into a field that helps people, whether it was development work in, you know, developing nations or human rights. I didn't know the route, but when I started to get involved in high school and I started a global issues club, it made it very apparent to me that I was very much interested in international relations. And that's why I went on to university to study political science and international relations and worked as a Red Cross global youth educator. And the more I was involved in different activities, the more I knew this was the place that I was meant to be. And my parents didn't pressure me in one direction. A lot of Persian parents, naturally, they want their kids to become either doctors or lawyers or engineers. Those are like the three only professions that exist in their mind. But thankfully, my parents just said, follow your heart, choose something you're passionate about, and that's the direction I went in.
You talked earlier about the so-called, and it's such a crazy term, but the beauty queen aspect of where you went in your life as well. And I wondered how that came into your life.
Well, it was just after I was working as a global youth educator, and I was reaching pockets of people at a time with 30 students here, 30 students there, and you know, we were effective in relating our messages on how to take action on an issue that's close to their heart. But I felt like these issues were very grand when we were speaking about landmine crisis or children that are affected by war, things like that, and I wanted to reach more people. And at this time, it seemed like people were listening more to sports stars and celebrities than they were politicians. So I said, well, how do I get a title for myself? And my sister was the one that said, well, have you ever thought of, you know, entering the Miss Canada competition? And at first I shrugged it off, but then I learned about the Miss World organization, and their motto was beauty with a purpose, and their aim was to raise money for children's charities, and they'd raised over $450 million.
Oh, wow.
So I said, wow, this is something, maybe it's a good avenue. And that's when I tried to, you know, enter the Miss Canada and won.
Yeah.
And then 2 weeks later, I was off to the Miss World competition.
Which has an enormous audience.
Yes.
Or had at the time.
It has 2.2 billion viewers. I think it's the most watched show after the FIFA World Championships.
Yes.
Yeah. And so I said, okay, this is a good platform.
Yeah.
And it really did give me a stronger voice and platform that I was looking for to raise more awareness on causes that I'm concerned about.
One of the disadvantages of beauty is that some people don't take you as seriously. Have you encountered that?
I did encounter it on a few occasions. I mean, just being labeled beauty queen or miss something, people automatically assume that you don't have a brain and, you know, you're just there as a ornament on display. But I think when people get to know the individuals that are competing often in these competitions, they really want to make a difference in their communities, and they want this title for a reason. So I think once you get past that, then people's minds and perspectives change. But up until this day, you know, it's hard to get away from the former Miss title.
Yeah.
Even though it's been almost 10 years
Sure.
since I competed, it's always in a title in the media
Yeah.
or whatever. And, you know, at the time I was using it to my advantage to spread awareness on a lot of these issues, including there was this one girl who was on death row in Iran that I campaigned for, and it helped in that regard, gaining media attention and signatures on the petition and pressure to have her released. But sometimes it's gratuitous. It's an extra thing that doesn't need to be in place. And I've done so much since that time.
You talked about this other girl on death row, the other Nazanin. How did you hear about her? What was it that? How did you hear about her in the first place?
Well, it was by luck. I think it's actually by fate that we got in contact with each other. Initially, not us directly, but it was a stranger from Paris who had read a small blog about this girl who was on death row because 3 men tried to rape her, and she defended herself and stabbed one of the men and was sentenced to death. And so he Googled the name Nazanin and by accident came on my website and told me about her story because he couldn't find anything about her. And I was really shocked by the injustices that I was hearing, the fact that this victim of attempted rape was being tried as a criminal, and the fact that she was a juvenile, and the fact that Iran had signed international treaties which forbid the executions of children. The more I learned about her case and the discrimination she was facing compelled me to want to, you know, start a campaign for her and see what I could do to change the outcome of this.
And you managed to do that?
Well, with the help of the international community.
Right.
It wasn't...
But you spearheaded an effort.
Yes, I spearheaded an effort, and we raised 350,000 signatures on the petition, and I lobbied government officials here in Canada and the European Union, eventually the United Nations, and anybody that would listen, I would, you know, speak about her and her case. The media helped a lot, putting pressure on the judiciary. So all in all the pressure did amount to her getting a stay of execution, and then the lawyers that were representing her were wonderful, and they managed to have the judiciary recognize that she was not guilty and she was exonerated of the murder charges.
You co-authored a book about the whole experience, and what's interesting is that it does allow you to juxtapose the two existences, the two women with this who share the same name but have such have led such different lives because of where they live.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I think we both were born as children in Iran, and we could have had very much similar parallel lives, but the fact that she remained in a country which is now very closed and very discriminatory in laws against women, and the fact that her family was also abusive. Her father was also very discriminatory. He didn't want the girls of the family to go to school. She had a very different life to mine, having been brought up here in Canada in a very free society where men and women are generally treated as equals, in a very loving, supportive home where my parents, don't see any difference between men and women, and very much encouraged myself and my sister to pursue our dreams. And having the opportunities here, you can see just how different our lives have ended up. But it's just mostly a matter of circumstance. So that's why, again, I'm so passionate about seeing a free and democratic Iran, because there's just so much potential in the people and the country. And I know, with a free democratic system, the people would prosper, and it would just be such a different outcome for the people and the nation.
Do you ever despair at the lack of humanity that you see in the world?
Yes, there are times when I despair to the point where I can't even get out of bed. And I just think, what a terrible world we live in. When you hear day to day on the news what's happening, and wars are continuing, and it can be very daunting, especially when you're personally in touch with families who are suffering, and you hear their cries on the phone, and you can't get their voices out of your mind in the middle of the night. But those are few and far between, because you just have to shut that side out, and you let the beauty and the humanity of this world to take over, and that's what inspires you. That's what I do. I mean, I just think about all the goodness, and I think that, of course, the news that you watch, they're highlighting things that are newsworthy, and in today's media, it seems like newsworthy are negatives. But you have to understand that there's so much good, and I've had the pleasure of working with so many amazing women and men who are trying to fight injustices and are trying to help humanity. So I get my inspiration from those things. So it is a balance again, but I've tried to make a point to live as well as working on my activism. Before, it was all-consuming, and I was like a horse with blinders on, but that wears you down, and you can just end up giving up. So now I'm all about balance and wanting to, have a good downtime as well, enjoying the company of my husband and eventually, my child and my family, at the same time as continuing my work.
I wish you the very best of luck moving forward. Good luck with the new baby as well.
Thank you, Kat.
When he or she arrives. And congratulations. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you.